10 years, son. 10 years, and not one of them ever knocked on that door. Curtis Boone's hands were shaking. His son was already walking toward the creek with a tape measure. "Daddy, how much did they pay us?" $200, $19.99. Then nothing. 10 feet high, 3 acres wide, on land the Boones had held since 1918. "Put that thing away, we're calling a lawyer." Eli didn't look up from the notebook. "No, sir, not yet." "Then what in God's name are you doing out here?" "Counting." His father stared at him. "Counting what?" 110,000 jars. 9 years later, that pile earned $412,000 a year. What did he see that nobody else could? Let me tell you about Elijah Boone, because you need to understand who he was before you can understand what he saw in 10 years of somebody else's garbage. He was 24 that spring, and he had just come home to Hancock County, Georgia, with a degree in food science from Tuskegee and no clear idea what a man was supposed to do with such a thing in a county where the only questions anybody asked about food were how many acres you could plant and what the buyer would pay. He had gone away on a partial scholarship and a Greyhound ticket and came back on the same bus line with 2 duffel bags and 3 spiral notebooks filled in a preservation course taught by a woman who talked about margins the way preachers talk about grace. The land was 180 acres of red clay and pine edge, and it had belonged to his family since 1918, when his great-grandfather put down cash money for it in a courthouse where the clerk made him sign twice because the first signature was too steady to be believed. 4 generations had held on to it. Through the boll weevil, through the Depression, through 2 decades when half the county's black families sold out and went north, and the other half stayed and learned to live small. Holding on had cost something, and the cost showed up in the man Eli's father had become. Curtis Boone was 58 that year. He raised peanuts and soybeans on the good acres, sold timber off the back line when the money ran thin, and made up the difference repairing other men's tractors in a shed with a dirt floor and a work light hung from a nail. He never charged what the work was worth because the men who brought him their equipment were his neighbors, and because a certain kind of caution had gotten into him young and never left. Here is where that caution came from, and you need to hold on to it because everything in this story bends around it. The Boone land had never gone through probate, not once, not in 4 generations. Eli's great-grandfather died without a will, and so did his grandfather after him. Under Georgia law that produced what the lawyers call heirs property, which is a polite phrase for ground owned in undivided fractions by every living descendant of the man who bought it. Cousins in Detroit owned a slice. A great-aunt in Jacksonville owned a slice. None of them knew it, and that was fine right up until somebody wanted the land. Then one unpaid tax bill, or one distant relative persuaded to sell his fraction to a stranger, could force all 180 acres to auction. Families across the South had lost everything that way, and Curtis Boone knew 2 of them within 30 miles. So Curtis did not make noise. He paid his taxes early. He kept a hardbound ledger in the shed where he wrote down every repair job, every part number, every dollar in and out. Because a man who writes things down can prove he is not the kind of man anybody needs to look at twice. He had spent 30 years being unremarkable on purpose, and had come to believe that unremarkable was the same thing as safe. Eli's mother, Dolores, had taught 4th grade in Sparta for 19 years, which meant half the adults under 40 in that end of the county had at some point been afraid of her. She was the one who told her son to go to Tuskegee, and the one who told him, the week he came back, that a degree on a wall does not feed anybody. And then there was his grandmother. Ruthie Mae Boone was 79 and lived in the front bedroom of the main house, and she kept a tin box on her dresser that had once held butter cookies and now held about 200 index cards written in a hand that got shakier as the decades went on. Preserves, relishes, pickles, chow chow. A fig preserve recipe dated 1961, The year she put 3 fig trees in the ground behind the house because her own mother had grown figs, and she did not intend to live somewhere that did not smell like them in August. Every year since, those trees made more fruit than the family could eat, sell, or give away, and most of it went soft on the ground, except what Ruthie Mae put up. But Eli had come home with something besides a diploma, and it was not in the duffel bags. Dr. Naomi Prather had taught food science at Tuskegee a long time, and she opened every semester the same way. George Washington Carver did not invent the peanut, she would tell them. He invented what to do with the peanut after you pulled it out of the ground. Then she would say the part Eli underlined twice. The most undervalued asset in American agriculture, she told them, is not the land or the seed or the equipment. It is the knowledge of what to do with what the land produces after the harvest. Most farmers stop at the edge of the field. The money is on the other side of that edge. Most farmers just never cross it. Let me tell you about the 3 acres by the creek because you need to understand what was on them before you can understand what it turned into. They were the worst 3 acres the family owned. Low, wet most of the year, cut by a slow creek that flooded every spring and left the ground too soft to work. Nobody had planted them since the 1940s. They were the kind of acres a farm carries the way a body carries a bad knee. In 1999, a foreman from Faraday Glass Works over in Milledgeville drove out and made Eli's grandfather an offer on the porch. Faraday manufactured mason jars and specialty containers for regional food producers, and their quality control line rejected a certain percentage of every run. The rejects had to go somewhere, and hauling them to the landfill cost money every month. The foreman proposed dumping on the low ground by the creek instead. $200 a year, a handshake and 1 page of writing and 2 signatures. Otis Boone signed it. $200 was $200, and the acres were doing nothing. Faraday paid in 1999. Faraday paid in 2000. Then the checks stopped. The trucks did not. Otis Boone died in 2006, and the trucks kept coming, 1 or 2 a month, backing down the field road at dawn and tipping their beds and pulling out again. Curtis called the plant 3 times. The first time he was told someone would look into it. The second time he was told the person who handled that had left the company. The third time nobody called back. He called the county twice, once the environmental office in Sparta, once a state complaint line. He gave his name, the location, the approximate volume. No inspector ever came. No citation was ever written. In 10 years, not one piece of paper existed anywhere in the state of Georgia acknowledging that any of it was happening. So he stopped calling. He told himself it was 3 bad acres, and that a man who makes noise about his land invites people to start asking exactly who owns it, and he knew what the honest answer would have looked like on paper. That was the situation Elijah Boone walked out to see on a Tuesday morning in March of 2009, 3 days after he came home. He had not been out there in 4 years. He came up the field road with his boots wet to the ankle and stopped where the road bent, and what he saw did not resolve into sense for a second or two because the shape of it was wrong for the land. It was a ridge, 10 feet high in places, running maybe 200 feet along the low ground, and it was catching the morning sun in 10,000 directions at once. He stood there a long time. Then he climbed up the near slope, careful about his footing, and picked one up. It was a quart jar. There was a chip on the rim, and he had to turn it in the light to find it, and it measured less than the width of the seam on his thumbnail. He set it down and picked up another. A pint, perfectly clear, with a single bubble the size of a grain of rice in the wall of the glass. Then half pints, wide-mouth quarts from some run Faraday had done for a pickle company. Not one of them was dangerous. Not one of them was broken. Every one of them had failed a standard that existed to protect an automated commercial line, where a rim 1 millimeter out of true means a seal that fails at scale. For a factory, that was a defect. For a woman making preserves in a farmhouse kitchen, it was invisible. Eli walked the length of the pile twice. He was not thinking about the injustice of it, not right then, though that came later and stayed. He was doing what 4 years at Tuskegee had trained him to do. He worked out the rough dimensions, guessed at density, and came off that field with a number he checked twice on paper that night. About 110,000 jars. And here was the part that mattered. The pile had been dumped, not stacked, which meant the ones at the bottom and at the impact edges had shattered under the weight of what came after. That glass had been working into the wet ground for a decade, and in spring, some of it was working toward the creek. But the jars that landed in the middle, cushioned by the ones already there, had come through intact. 70,000 of them, near enough. So he stood in the low ground of his family's farm and saw two things at the same time, and neither one of them canceled the other out. He was looking at a dump site. He was also looking at 10 years of free, raw material. He brought it up that evening on the porch, and the argument that followed was the only real fight Elijah Boone ever had with his father. Curtis wanted to sue. He said it flat, the way a man says a thing he has carried a long time and finally decided to set down. Faraday had breached the agreement in 2001 and had been trespassing every month for 8 years since, and there had to be a lawyer in Macon who would take it. Eli told him what a suit would actually cost. 3 years, most likely. A retainer the family did not have. And discovery, meaning Faraday's attorneys would eventually ask the one question nobody in the Boone family had ever wanted asked out loud in a courtroom. Who exactly owns this land? And how many of them are there? And where do they live now? Curtis went quiet at that, because he had thought of it himself for 8 years and had never once said it out loud. Then Eli laid out the other idea. He wanted to wash them, sterilize them, fill them, sell them. His father looked at him a long moment, and when he answered, his voice was not loud. They dumped their trash on our land for 10 years, Curtis said, because they knew we wouldn't do anything about it. And now you want to go out there and pick it up and sell it back to the world. Do you know what that looks like? Eli did not raise his voice either, and the answer he gave was the sentence the whole business would be built on. I know what it looks like, he said. I also know what it is. They've been paying us in raw material for 10 years and they were too careless to notice. My input cost starts at 0, Daddy. Neither man moved. Dolores had come to the screen door partway through and had not opened it. It was Ruthie Mae who broke it. She had been in her chair at the end of the porch the whole time, not saying anything, which was her habit. She got up and went inside and came back out with the butter cookie tin under her arm and set it on the table between them with a sound that ended the conversation. Then wash me 100 of them, she said. I'll show you how. He washed 140. It took 2 days. He hauled them up from the creek 6 crates at a time and ran them through a wash cycle he built out of a stock tank, a propane burner, and a thermometer, because he knew from Dr. Prather's course exactly what temperature and hold time would take glass from a field to a kitchen with nothing living on it. He inspected every rim under a work light and rejected the ones with chips that broke the ceiling surface, about 1 in 9. The fruit came out of the chest freezer on the back porch. There were no figs on a tree in Georgia in March and would not be until the end of July. But Ruthie Mae had put up 9 gallons off the 3 trees the previous August, the way she had every August of her life. She thawed bag after bag in the sink and did not ask what it was for. She stood at his elbow through the first 4 batches with the index card in her hand, which she did not need and did not look at once. He made adjustments she did not approve of. He cut the sugar by 1/5 and added lemon to bring the set back, which was a preservation science answer to a problem she had solved by feel for 50 years. And she tasted it off the wooden spoon and said nothing for about 10 seconds and then said, "Put that on the card." By May, he had a cottage food license from the state. In June, he had a folding table at the farmer's market in Sparta, 48 jars of fig preserves, a sign he had lettered himself, and a price of $6 a half pint. He sold out in 2 hours and 40 minutes. He drove home, made more out of the freezer, came back the next Saturday, and sold out again. Let me tell you about that season, because everything that came after was decided inside it. He built the line outward from whatever the county could give him in the order it gave it. Pepper jelly in July. The fresh figs came at the end of that month and ran into September, and for 6 weeks he was making preserves faster than he could wash glass. Chow chow and dill pickles off 2 more cards out of the tin, with the brine ratios reworked to hold acidity where the science said it needed to hold. A tomato jam in August that confused people for 4 seconds before they bought 2 jars. Muscadine jelly in September. Sweet potato butter in October. By the end of that first season, he had 7 products, a waiting list, and a decision. He could stay where he was. The market table was profitable and manageable, and would never in his life amount to more than a few $1,000s a year. Or he could try to cross the edge his professor had spent 2 years describing to a room of students who mostly were not listening. He sat down at the kitchen table one night in November with the spiral notebook and wrote out what he knew. That the product was good, that the glass was free and a decade of it lay 200 yards from the house, that the farm had unused capacity in the trees and the vines, and in his father's relationships with every grower for 20 miles, that the market table was capped by geography and by season. At the bottom of the page, he wrote this: "The jars are free, the recipes are hers, the land is ours, the story is true, the only thing missing is somebody to tell it to." He wrote 11 letters to specialty grocers and food cooperatives in Athens, Macon, and Atlanta, and put a jar of fig preserves in every one of them. 3 wrote back. 2 said no. The one that said yes was a food cooperative in Athens called Broad Street Provisions, and the offer was not much. 6 jars of each variety on consignment. They moved in 9 days. The buyer asked for 24 of each. Those went in 11. She called a 3rd time and asked whether he could supply her monthly, and Elijah Boone said he could, and drove home in December with the window cracked and a feeling in his chest he did not entirely trust. By the end of the following February, he was in 4 stores, and he had run the arithmetic on what 4 stores required and understood he could not do it with a stock tank and a propane burner in a shed. So let me tell you about the winter and spring of 2010, because that is when Hancock County said no to him 3 separate times, and because of how it said it. The first no came from a bank in Milledgeville. He asked for $18,000 for processing equipment and brought a business plan, 8 months of sales records, 3 signed purchase orders, and the state license. The loan officer read all of it, asked good questions, and seemed honestly interested. Then he asked about collateral, and Eli explained the land, and the officer asked whether the deed was in his father's name. It was in his great-grandfather's name and had been since 1918. The letter came 11 days later. The stated reason was the absence of collateral with clear and marketable title, and every word of it was accurate. Nobody in that building did anything wrong. The bank could not lend against ground that 30-some heirs owned in fractions, and it did not matter that 4 generations of Boones had paid the taxes without once being late. The question was what the bank could take if he failed. The answer was nothing, and so the answer to him was no. He sat in the truck in the yard a while before he went inside, and he did not tell his father the reason, because he knew exactly what his father would hear in it. The second no did not announce itself as a no at all. It came from the county, and it took the form of a folder sitting on a desk. To sell into retail at volume, he needed his processing space inspected and certified. The shed would not do, so he had spent the winter converting the west half of the equipment barn. A proper floor, running water, a 3-basin sink, lights bright enough to read a rim under. He submitted the application in the first week of March. Nothing happened. Nothing happened for 11 weeks. He did not call and complain. He drove up to the office in Sparta every Tuesday morning, sat on a hallway bench older than he was, and when somebody came out, he asked the same question in the same voice. Any word on the Boone application? Not annoyed, not pleading. The same words week after week in a tone that gave nobody anything to react to. A farm out on the east side of the county submitted a nearly identical application 6 weeks after his. They were approved in 10 days. Eli found that out the way you find out anything in a county that size. Somebody mentioned it in a feed store without knowing what he was saying. He said nothing about it at the office. He wrote both dates in the spiral notebook and kept driving up on Tuesdays. His certification came through in the last week of May. Nobody in that office was ever rude to him. Not one time, not one word. That is the part worth sitting with, and the part most people telling this story get wrong. There was no insult to point at, no moment you could put on a page. There was a folder that did not move, and a folder 6 weeks behind it that did. And a young man who understood exactly what he was looking at, and decided the most useful thing he could do was be impossible to characterize. The third no came in person, and it drove a county truck. Ray Dennard was 57 and had run the Agricultural Extension Office in Hancock County for 19 years, watching young people come home from agricultural colleges with ideas that did not survive contact with actual farming. He was not a cruel man. He had simply developed a professional skepticism and wore it like a coat he never took off. 3 families in that county had tried value-added ventures in the 1990s. 2 folded inside 3 years. The third limped along at a scale that never justified the work. He came out in the middle of June, a few weeks after the certification cleared, because he had heard there was a boy on the Boone place running jars through a barn. He looked at what Eli had built: the sink, the burners, the racks, and behind it all the washed glass stacked to the joists, 1,600 jars catching the light. "That's a lot of glass for a hobby," Dennard said. Eli told him it was not a hobby, and told him about Broad Street and the 3 other accounts and the sourcing he was arranging for the coming season. Dennard heard him out and then said what he had said to others before. Specialty food is a trend, not a market. The margins look good right up until your input costs catch up with you, and then you're standing in a barn full of glass with nobody to sell to. He said it without cruelty and without doubt, because he sincerely believed he was saving the young man 2 years. "My input costs are lying out by the creek, Mr. Dennard," Eli said. "They've been driving themselves here for 10 years. Dennard smiled the smile a man produces when he has decided not to argue, wished him luck, and got in the truck. Eli called Tuskegee that night and told Dr. Prather the whole thing. "Write down exactly what he said," she told him. "Word for word. You're going to want to remember it." He wrote it down. Then he solved the money the only way left to him. A cannery in Dublin had gone under that winter, and its owner sold him a steam kettle and a 2-basket water bath canner on a handshake and a signed page, $300 a month for 19 months, because he wanted the equipment gone and had no more use for banks than Eli did. An estate auction in Sandersville sold him a label printer for $340. Every dollar of net that first year went back into the barn. The research is the part everybody skips, and the part that explains everything that came after. Dr. Naomi Prather had spent a decade studying what she called the pantry economy, the market for preserved, shelf-stable, small-batch food. Her work, published in 2007, documented something the specialty industry already understood and almost no farmer had absorbed. The premium consumers paid for locally made preserved food was not a trend premium. It was structural, and it rested on 3 things industry could not replicate no matter what it spent. The first was provenance, the ability to name the farm, the county, the family, the woman whose handwriting the recipe was in. Big producers could approximate that on a label but could not make it true, and consumers were getting better at telling the difference. The second was variety. A muscadine jelly off vines along one fence line in one county existed in no chain supply catalog anywhere. The third was scarcity, which held a price volume never could. Her data showed that in 2006, the average wholesale price for industrial jam was $1.14 a unit. For documented farm-identified small-batch product, It was $3.80. Eli had read that study 4 times before he ever filled a jar. Now he built a spreadsheet out of it, adjusted for Georgia input costs, and found where the arithmetic changed character. At 10,000 units a year, he had a good side business. At 40,000, with the glass costing nothing and 2/3 of the fruit off ground his family already owned, he had something that could carry a farm. He hired his first 2 employees in the spring of 2011. Women from the south end of the county who had worked seasonal shifts at a poultry plant and knew how to work and how to be quiet about it. Production reached 19,800 units and wholesale revenue $75,240. He added 6 accounts, one a store in Atlanta that had been on his waiting list for 8 months. And then in February of 2012, Faraday Glassworks finally answered. The letter came from a law firm in Macon, 2 pages long, extremely polite. It observed that every jar bore the letters FGW molded into the base. It stated that the material had never been formally abandoned. That title remained with the manufacturer, and that using containers bearing the company's mark to sell goods commercially infringed Faraday's trademark and converted company property. It demanded the practice cease immediately. 10 years of trucks, 3 unanswered calls, 2 unanswered complaints, not 1 piece of paper. Then a business reporter for the County Weekly ran 4 paragraphs about a young man in Hancock County selling preserves in 9 stores, and Faraday answered in 4 days. That night was the worst night in the history of the business, and it happened at the kitchen table. Curtis Boone did not say "I told you so." What he said was worse because it was quiet and reasonable. "This is the thing I have been trying to keep off this land my entire life," he said. "You make yourself visible, and people who never once thought about you start thinking about you. And the first thing they want to know is what you've got and how firmly you've got hold of it." Eli had 2 employees who had quit other work for him, orders he had committed to, and $11,000 of inventory in a barn he now had a letter telling him he could not legally use. He came very close to stopping, and he has said so since, without decorating it. What he did instead was go get the ledgers. He went to the shed and asked his father for the hardbound book, the one Curtis had kept for 30 years, because a man who writes things down can prove what kind of man he is. And in the back of it, running from 2002 through 2009, was a list of dates in his father's cramped hand. Every truck, the date, the time, sometimes the weather. 7 years of them. Curtis had never done anything with the list. He had not known what to do with it. He had written it down because writing things down was the only protest available to a man who could not afford to be seen protesting. Eli sat with that book open a long time. Then he built a file, the 1999 agreement, out of his grandmother's dresser. 2 signatures, one of them a Faraday foreman's. The bank record showing 2 payments and nothing after. His father's 7 years of dates. Photographs of the pile with a 6-foot ladder in frame for scale. And a note of the 2 complaints Curtis had made and the fact that no inspector had ever come. He wrote 1 letter back. It was short. It did not raise its voice, and it made exactly 1 argument. If the glass on those 3 acres was still the property of Faraday Glassworks, then Faraday had been storing 110,000 units of company property on private land for 10 years without an agreement and without payment. He asked when the company intended to settle the storage costs, when it intended to remediate ground the broken material had been working into since 2002, and when it intended to pay the amounts unpaid since 2001. He mailed it and filled orders for 5 weeks while nothing happened. In the 6th week, a man drove down from Milledgeville by himself without a lawyer and asked for Elijah Boone. Marcus Reyes had been running the Faraday plant a little under 2 years. He had inherited a file room nobody had reconciled since the 1990s and a hauling budget that never made sense. And when the letter reached his desk with photographs attached, he understood what he was looking at. He asked to see it. Eli took him out the field road. Reyes walked the length of the pile and back, then stood at the near end with his hands in his jacket pockets for a good while. "We should have dealt with this 8 years ago," he said. What came out of that visit was a supply agreement in writing. Faraday would deliver its rejected run to the Boone farm at no charge, palletized and stacked on a schedule. It would pay to screen and remediate the 3 acres, and it granted written consent for the sale of goods in containers bearing its mark, on the one condition that no label ever name the company. In exchange, Boone would make no claim on the amounts unpaid since 2001. Nobody in this story won because somebody was kind to him. Eli won because his father had written down the dates. The trucks kept coming after that, but differently. On pallets, shrink-wrapped, stacked upright on the 3rd Tuesday of the month. The difference between garbage and inventory turned out to be almost entirely a matter of how it arrives. That summer, Hancock County stopped getting rain. It was not a catastrophic drought, just the ordinary kind that does not make national news, and it cut peanut and soybean yields across the county by an average of 31%. Prices that fall sounded reasonable if you did not know anything, and if you did, you understood that a reasonable price against a yield like that, with input costs fixed in April, meant a hard autumn. A lot of families in that county had one. The Boone farm had a hard autumn too, out in the fields. But the figs and the vines were on a drip line Eli had run off the farm pond the year before, out of the first real money the business made, which his father had called an expensive answer to a problem the good Lord usually handled. And the processing operation did not care what the yields were. It ran on watered fruit, on contracts with growers across 4 counties, and on glass that arrived on the 3rd Tuesday of the month, regardless of the weather. Boone Farm Pantry finished 2012 at $94,800 in revenue, with a net margin of 46%. The farm's total income that year, the reduced peanut and soybean money plus the pantry, was higher than in 2010, before the dry summer, before anything. Eli did not say one word about that at the county meeting in November. He did not need to. Ray Dennard drove past the Boone place on his way to Milledgeville in October and saw the barn lit up at 7 in the morning. He came back the same road that evening and it was lit at 8. He sat with that a while and said nothing to anybody for another 6 months. March of 2013 nearly ended the business by giving it exactly what it had been asking for. A food writer named Camille Ashworth covered regional producers for a magazine called Southern Larder. Somebody handed her a jar of fig preserves at a wedding in Athens. She ate it on toast 3 mornings in a row, and on the 3rd morning she turned the jar around and called the number on the label. Eli answered next to a running kettle. The piece ran that March at 4,000 words, and the headline was, "The Glass Mountain of Hancock County." It told the whole thing, the handshake and the $200 a year, the checks that stopped and the trucks that did not, the 10 years without a citation, the 11 weeks a folder sat on a desk in Sparta. Ashworth had asked for documents, and Eli had given her documents, and she had checked every one, and the article named dates. The photograph that ran with it was taken in the barn. Eli in the middle of it, glass stacked to the joists behind him, holding a half pint of fig preserves up into a bar of light coming through a gap in the boards. The jar came out amber. The piece went online on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, the website his cousin Andre had built for him in 2011 for a case of preserves and gas money had taken 4,000 visitors. By Saturday morning, there were 847 orders. By Monday, there were 2,300. He had 3 people, counting himself. He called Marcus Reyes and asked whether the March delivery could be moved up, and a truck came the following Monday. He bought everything every grower under contract could spare, then called growers he did not have under contract. He hired 4 temporary workers out of Sparta and ran the kettles 18 hours a day for 6 weeks. His mother came out after school and labeled until dark, and Ruthie Mae sat by the cooling racks with a work light and inspected rims, which she was 83 and better at than anyone. They filled every order, all 2,300 of them. Not one refund, not one cancellation. In every box, he put a note in his own handwriting. Thank you for finding us. We are still here. We are still making it the same way. Elijah Boone, Hancock County, Georgia. The reorder rate from those 2,300 customers was 63%. In April, Ray Dennard came back. He parked in the same place he had parked in June of 2010, and Eli came out and stood in the barn doorway, which was where he had been standing the first time. Dennard looked at the barn a moment before he walked over. "I owe you a conversation," he said. Eli told him, "All right." Dennard said he had called specialty food a trend and not a market, and had said the margins would catch up with him, and that he had been wrong on both. Then he said the part that cost him something. "And I was wrong in how I said it. I said it like a man who'd already made up his mind before he got out of the truck." Eli did not let him off. Dennard had told him he would be better off putting the barn to something that made money year-round. The barn made money year-round now, he said, and had made it in the dry year when a lot of people in the county could not say the same. He said it without any anger, the way a man states a thing that has been verified. "The lesson isn't that preserves beat peanuts," he added. "The lesson is that any farm standing on one thing only needs one bad year to find out how thin it was standing." "I know," Dennard said. "That's why I came." He asked whether Eli would speak at the Extension office's spring meeting. There were families in that county who needed to hear it, he said, and Eli was the right person to say it. 41 farmers came in May. Dennard introduced him and said some of them knew Elijah Boone and some knew his people, and all of them ought to hear him. Then he sat in the front row and did not speak again until the question period, when he asked the first question the way a student asks one. Curtis Boone had driven himself. Eli had not told him he was speaking, and learned afterward that Dennard had called the shed the week before and told his father he ought to come. When the room applauded at the end, Curtis stood up first. He stood the way a man stands when he has run out of words, and standing is the only thing left to do with his hands. Let me tell you about the years between then and 2017, because they went the way real growth goes, which is to say without a single moment worth filming. By 2014, there were 47 accounts in 7 states and 31 varieties on the sheet. The fig orchard was going in by stages on ground that had been in peanuts, and 2 hives came with it, which Curtis took on because he had kept bees as a boy. At 40 acres, the orchard supplied a bit under 2/3 of what the operation needed. The rest came from 11 contracted farms across 4 counties. Every contract traceable to somebody who had been in the room in May of 2013, or had heard about it, and had called to ask whether Boone needed what they grew. He almost always did. The 3 acres by the creek were screened in 2015, and Faraday paid for it as agreed. The broken material was dug, washed, sorted, and hauled out over 5 weeks, and the low ground was regraded and left to rest. Curtis Boone did the other necessary thing in those years, and started it without telling anybody. He hired a lawyer in Macon who specialized in heirs property, and the 2 of them spent 14 months tracking down 31 living descendants of a man who had died in 1954. 29 signed. 2 wanted paying, and Eli paid them out of the business. In November of 2015, the deed to 180 acres in Hancock County, Georgia, was recorded clean and whole for the first time since 1918. Eli walked into a credit union in Macon that January with that deed, and the same kind of folder he had carried into a bank 6 years earlier. The approval came in 11 days. The building went up that year beside the barn with a slab poured over a drainage layer of crushed glass, because Eli could not bring himself to pay a hauler to take away the broken material his family had already been made to keep for 10 years. 9 full-time employees moved into it before the end of 2016. The loan was paid off in 31 months. Which brings us to the offer. It came in the spring of 2017 from a regional grocery chain with about 90 stores across Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. Their private label buyer, a man named Hal Brenneman, flew into Macon, drove out, sat in the office off the production floor, and put a number on the table larger than anything Elijah Boone had ever been offered. 50,000 units a year, more than double everything the plant was then producing across every account combined. The price was $2.10 a unit. Eli did the arithmetic that night, and it came out where he expected. At $2.10, he would be producing below his own average margin, and to hit 50,000 units, he would have to buy fruit outside his contracted network, commodity fruit, from wherever it was cheapest that month, which meant he could no longer say where anything in the jar came from, which meant the provenance was gone, which meant the entire structural premium Dr. Prather had spent a decade documenting would be traded away for volume. That alone would have been a hard call. It was not the hard part. The hard part was the second condition, and Brenneman had not led with it because men like Brenneman never do. The product would carry the chain's own private label, their brand, their design, their trade dress. No Boone. No Hancock County. No line of small type at the bottom that read, "From the recipes of Ruthie Mae Boone, 1961. Brenneman said it in the friendliest way imaginable, leaning back, hands open, a man doing a favor. "The name doesn't move product in our market, son," he said. "The product moves product." Eli sat with that for the rest of the day and most of the night, and here is why it landed the way it landed. 8 years earlier, his father had stood on the porch and asked whether he knew what it looked like. A Boone going out to the low ground to gather up what a company had dumped there because they knew nobody would stop them, and selling it. Eli had answered that he knew what it looked like, and also knew what it was, and the 8 years since had proved him right in every measurable way. And now the same question had come back around and put itself in front of him again, wearing a suit and holding a purchase order. Only this time it did not come from failure. It came from success. That was the cruelty of it. They were not offering to take the glass off him anymore. They were offering to buy the name off the jar. $500,000 a year in gross revenue to be nobody inside his own container. And the pressure was not abstract. There were 9 people on the payroll with houses and cars and children in the Sparta schools. There was a second expansion he had drawn up and quoted. There was a wife, married the year before, who had come into a house with a mortgage on a building and an orchard 3 years short of full bearing. And there was his grandmother, 87 that spring, thin over the winter, who did not come out to the cooling racks anymore, and who kept the butter cookie tin on the dresser where it had always been. He carried the offer into the house and put it on the kitchen table. It was the same table. Curtis Boone read the offer the way he read everything, slowly and twice. Dolores read it after him. Nobody said anything for a while, and the only sound in the kitchen was the clock over the stove that had been running fast for 2 years. What Eli expected his father to say was the practical thing. 9 employees, a quoted expansion, $500,000. What his father said instead was this: "I kept my mouth shut for 10 years because I thought quiet is what kept this land," Curtis said. "I was wrong about that. What keeps land is your name being on it where people can see it." He set the pages down and pushed them back across the table with 2 fingers. Eli called Hal Brenneman on a Monday and told him no. Brenneman did not understand it at first. He had spent 20 years buying from small producers, and small producers said yes. They said yes to whatever volume he put in front of them, because volume was the thing they had all been praying for, and he had watched dozens of them say yes and then work themselves half to death honoring it. So he assumed there had been a misunderstanding and called back Tuesday morning to walk through the numbers again. Eli told him he had understood the offer perfectly the first time. Then he made a counter, in one breath, so there would be no confusion about which parts were negotiable. $3.40 a unit, his standard wholesale price, which he did not intend to discount for anybody. 20,000 units a year, not 50, because 20,000 was what he could produce without buying a pound of fruit off a broker, and the sourcing was the product. And the label stayed exactly as it was. The farm name, the county, and the line at the bottom about the recipes and the year. Brenneman said he would have to take that upstairs. Then nothing happened for 3 days. Let me tell you what those 3 days were actually like, because it is easy to describe the decision and hard to describe the waiting. Eli went to work every one of them. The plant ran a pepper jelly batch on Wednesday and a chow chow batch on Thursday, and he stood the line for both because there was nothing else to do with his hands. He had turned down the largest offer anybody had ever made him over a line of type about 6 point on a label 2.5 inches wide, and he had done it with a payroll of 9 people who did not know the offer existed. He did not tell them. That is worth saying. He did not gather anybody up and make a speech about principle. He ran the kettles. On Wednesday evening, he walked out to the low ground by the creek, which he had not done in a while. It had been screened and regraded and was growing over in volunteer grass, and the ridge that had stood 10 feet high through his entire early 20s was simply gone, and the light coming off the water was ordinary light with nothing in it to catch. He stood there about as long as he had stood there the first time. What he was weighing was not really money, and he knew it. It was the same question his father had asked him on the porch when he was 24, which the 8 years since had answered so thoroughly he had stopped hearing it. Do you know what that looks like? He had been able to say then that he knew what it was. The offer asked whether he still did, whether a jar with somebody else's name on it and fruit from nowhere in particular inside it was still the thing he had built, or whether it was just glass again. On Friday afternoon, the phone rang in the office off the production floor, and Eli let it go 2 rings before he picked it up, and then he stood there listening for about 40 seconds without saying a word. Brenneman said yes, all 3 conditions. 20,000 units at $3.40 with the label untouched. It added $68,000 a year in wholesale revenue and was the largest single-account Boone Farm Pantry had ever signed. Eli found out later, not from Brenneman but from a marketing manager at a trade show 2 years afterward, why it had gone through. The chain's marketing side had read the piece in Southern Larder when it ran, and had wanted the Hancock County name on a shelf tag long before Brenneman ever drove out. He had simply been doing what buyers do, which is to see whether it could be had for less. Which is the joke at the center of this whole thing, and Eli has told it on himself in a dozen rooms since. The story he refused to sell was the reason they were buying. He called Tuskegee that night. Dr. Prather listened to the whole account without interrupting once, the offer and the counter and the 3 days, and when he finished, she said the thing she had been waiting the better part of a decade to say to somebody. I told you the money was on the other side of the edge. You did, Eli said. She asked how many jars were sitting in that building right now, and he turned in the office doorway and looked out at the racked and washed glass and told her somewhere around 40,000. She laughed for a long time. Let me tell you about 2018, because 2018 is the year the number became real. Boone Farm Pantry finished that year at $412,000 in revenue. The margin came in at 41%, a few points under the early years because of what a payroll of 11 costs. But the net was $168,920. Combined with what the row crop acres still brought in, it was the highest income the Boone family had recorded in any year since a man signed his name twice in a courthouse in 1918. Curtis sat down with the annual summary in December and read all of it, and then set it down and said, without any preamble at all, that his son would decide the rotation the following year. All of it. Eli thanked him. His father nodded and went back to his coffee, and that was the whole of it. The 412,000 made its way around Hancock County the way numbers move in small places, which is to say imperfectly and completely. By January, there was not a farmer in that county who had not heard some version. Some said 300,000, some said 500. Some were certain it was profit, not revenue. The accuracy did not matter. What mattered was that a number existed, that it was large, and that it had come off a pile of trash every one of them had driven past for 10 years without turning their head. 7 farms in that county started value-added operations of their own before the end of 2019. 3 called Eli before they started, and he gave them everything. The spreadsheet built off Dr. Prather's study, updated for current Georgia input costs and retail pricing, the licensing sequence, the name of the equipment auctioneer in Sandersville. He gave it the way it had been given to him, which was not as a promise. Here is what the data shows. Here is what the margin looks like if you do this honestly. Here is where people usually get it wrong. In the spring of 2019, he spoke at a state agricultural diversification conference to a room of 200 people for 40 minutes without notes. He told them about the glass and the folding table in Sparta and the 11 weeks a folder sat on a desk and gave the 2 dates and did not editorialize on either. He told them about the letter from the law firm in Macon and the hardbound ledger in his father's shed. He told them about the dry summer and about the offer he turned down and the offer he took and the difference between them, which was 6-point type. He did not tell any of it with anger. He told it as evidence. This is what happened. This is what the numbers showed. This is what changed. At the end, a young woman in the 3rd row raised her hand and asked what he would say to somebody with an idea that every single person around her was calling impractical. Eli thought about it for a moment. Write down exactly what they tell you, he said, word for word. You're going to want to remember it. The room was quiet for about a second. Then it was not. Ruthie Mae Boone did not live to hear that sentence said in front of 200 people, but she lived to see the first shipment go out under the grocery chain contract in the fall of 2017, with the line about her recipes and the year 1961 on every one of 20,000 labels. Eli set a case of the first run by her chair, and she took one out and turned it around to read the small type, which she had to hold at arm's length by then. She looked at it a good while. Then she asked whether he had cut the sugar in that one too, and he told her he had, and she said she had never once admitted he was right about that and did not intend to start. She passed the following March at 88 in the front bedroom. She had been told the summer before what her great-granddaughter would be called, and received it with a small nod, as though it were the only sensible option and had taken them a while to reach. The tin box stayed on the dresser a year before anybody could move it, and then it went into the office at the plant where it still is. Let me tell you about one morning in October of 2021, because the story does not end with a contract, and it does not end with a number. Eli was on the floor at 7 checking inventory when his daughter came in wearing rubber boots 2 sizes too big and carrying a notebook off his desk. Ruthie was 4. She sat on a wooden crate, opened it, held a pencil over the page with tremendous seriousness, and asked her father what he thought about making soap. She had it worked out. Soap could go in jars. The farm had honey from the 2 hives her grandfather kept at the edge of the orchard, and a bar of honey soap at the store in Sparta cost $4, which struck her as a great deal of money. It is a lot, Eli agreed. She said they could make it cheaper. We could make it better, he told her. She wrote something in the notebook. It was not a word, she was 4, but she wrote it with total conviction, and her father stood there watching her do it and felt something go through him that he did not have a name for, which was the feeling of understanding that the thing you built has already outlasted the building of it. He was standing, while that happened, on a concrete floor poured in 2016. Underneath it is crushed glass. The broken portion, the decade of it that had shattered under its own weight in the low ground and been dug out and washed and screened and hauled up the field road the year before the building went up. He is standing on exactly what they dumped there. Boone Farm Pantry still operates in Hancock County, Georgia. The facility has been expanded twice since 2016. There are 57 varieties on the sheet now, including, since 2022, 3 kinds of honey soap that retail for $8.50 a bar and sell out within 2 weeks of every run. The orchard covers 62 acres. The contracted grower network is 19 farms across 4 counties. The 3 acres by the creek grow figs. The oldest trees down there were propagated from cuttings off one of the 3 that Ruthie Mae Boone put in the ground in 1961. Faraday still delivers on the 3rd Tuesday under the same agreement. Marcus Reyes retired in 2020, and the man who replaced him honored it without being asked to, because he had read the article and understood what it would cost the company to be the one who ended it. Ray Dennard retired from the Extension Office in 2017. He still comes to the county meetings. He and Elijah Boone are not friends exactly, but they are something. 2 men who each know precisely what the other got wrong and what the other got right. And in a county that size, that is a relationship with its own kind of weight. Curtis Boone is 73. He leases the row crop acres to a neighbor and spends most of his time in the orchard and with the hives, tending them with the same methodical care he once gave to other men's tractors. He does not talk much about what his son built. He does not have to. The orchard says it for him. The hard-bound ledger hangs in a frame in the hallway of the plant, open to the back pages where 7 years of dates run down the margin in a cramped hand. The 1999 agreement hangs beside it. New employees ask, and somebody always explains. Dr. Naomi Prather is 81 and retired from Tuskegee. Every December, a case arrives at her door. She has never asked for it and has never been sent an invoice. She opens it and eats the fig preserves on toast 3 mornings in a row, as she has every December for 14 years. And she thinks about the edge she spent 30 years describing to rooms of students who were mostly not listening. The edge that most farmers never cross. And she thinks about the ones who do. Elijah Boone is 39. He runs a food company that did not exist when he was 23. He built it out of free glass, his grandmother's index cards, a notebook full of somebody else's research, and a willingness to stand in a wet field doing arithmetic. He had no business plan. No bank believed him. No county office saw what he saw. What he had was 180 acres 4 generations had managed to hold, a professor's voice in his head, and 10 years of another company's garbage sitting on top of it. They put it there because they were certain nobody would ever do anything about it. They called it a hobby. The rain stopped. The field margins collapsed. The pantry held. The jars were free. The knowledge was his. The name stayed on the label. And the soap, as it turns out, is excellent.